John is a senior fellow and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Brookings, the Brookings Institution. He's also a senior advisor to the United Nations Foundation and a board governor for the International Development Research Center. And he serves as a member of the UNICEF Advisory Group. I've been working very hard to try to convince the US Congress that the US should be part of UNICEF again. So there's something in common that we have there. He co-founded this 17 Rooms project back in 2018 and had been director of the UN Millennium Project, under which was Secretary General Kofi Annan's independent advisory body, which was mandated to recommend an action plan for achieving the Millennium Development Goals. And I have a very fond memory of the Millennium Development Goals because I pushed very hard for the Development Assistance Committee to come up with its own goals, and they eventually, after a lot of to and fro, became the UN Millennium Development Goals. Very pleased with that. But John has been very active within the UN system, and I just give you a little more background. He's a Canadian citizen, born in Vancouver. He completed his bachelor's degree at the University of British Columbia, his master's in public policy at the Kennedy School at Harvard, where I once taught, and has a PhD in economics from Oxford University, which he attended as a Rhodes Scholar. So he has not only been a really effective practitioner in this field, but also with a very strong academic background. I was very excited to hear about this project, and because one of the frustrations you have if you run a development agency, as I have, is that it's wonderful to have the goals and the strategic objectives out there, but then you need action plans. And to the extent that you can get global consensus on what not only the goals are, but the action plans are, it's really, really useful. So Dr. McArthur, let me ask you to start by maybe telling us a little bit about how the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted, because it was a very different system than we used for the Millennium Development Goals, which were really mostly done by donors and then bought onto by developing countries. This was a different process. And maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about that.
Well, by coincidence, I was on an email thread earlier today with some of your progenitors of the IDGs and MDGs, Brian, with Richard Carey and the like.
Yes.
Exactly, rehashing some of this history. And I think one of the basic points that I find myself stressing is there's so many pieces to each of these big puzzles, because the work that you did that was so instrumental, I feel like if the term standing on the shoulders of giants is operative here or anywhere, it must be here, because the work of the IDGs led to the MDGs. The IDGs were themselves in many ways, my interpretation, but you would have your own more proximate take, really a distillation of a lot of the international agreements of the 1990s.
Sure. Right.
And at the time when I got involved with the MDGs, of which there were 8 goals, and this was after the 90s, which some of us in retrospect see as a period of crisis for globalization, but also halcyon days for the multilateral cooperation. As the Cold War ended for a little while, there was peace in the land of the international system. And a lot of the tensions back then were about everything that got left out. And how can you only have 8 of these goals, which were anchored in a core concept of supporting the people who had been most left behind amid the fruits of globalization, the poorest of the poor, and issues not just of income poverty, but what it means to have a productive life and the human capabilities, especially as at the time were discussed through education and health, but also things like access to water and sanitation, and the need for the international community to be much more supportive, much more goal-oriented, much more directive. And my interpretation, but please, Brian, correct where I misspeak, was that a lot of this also was about making the case for how resources could be used well. And so if used well, therefore more could show up to do more of what's good.
Exactly.
That essence of clarifying results for issues that really matter and are of consequence to the poorest people in the world. And the foremost set of issues ended up being around health issues of, I would say, life and death. And the HIV/AIDS pandemic was arguably most crucial, is like driving a battering ram through the fortress of the international system, such as it was, to really blow the door open to say, we have to think utterly differently about how we invest in people, keeping them alive, and making sure the basic life-saving technologies are accessible universally. That led to things like the launch of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. It came on the heels of, but was consistent with, the launch of Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations. It also was, I would argue, interconnected with the launch of PEPFAR, the US Presidential Emergency Program for AIDS Relief under President Bush, and later the President's Malaria Initiative in 2005. And all of which in the US was launched under a Republican-led administration. And it was really around this notion of measuring for results, getting clarity on what money was for, and then mobilizing significant volumes of resources for those undertakings in places that couldn't afford them otherwise. That basic sequence, and I later did some ex post research on where things did and didn't change, and it's pretty clear that the health metrics changed, 20 to 30 million extra people alive due to those changes in progress. Exact pathways of causality are to be teased out still in academic debates and undertakings. Education, though, had similar breakthroughs, at least in terms of number of kids going to school, tens of millions extra, could be as many as 70 million extra kids going to school than would have happened on a otherwise trajectory. But some issues like water and sanitation, you can't really see the delta. You can't really see what changed because the systems didn't necessarily change as a result. That is a crucial backdrop to this question you've rightly raised of, well, where did these sustainable development goals come from? It came from a few threads coming together. One was, goals can work. Goals can be decisive rallying points for getting people together from very diverse constituencies to mobilize technology, institutions, systems, multi-sector partnerships, and resources towards outputs and outcomes. Outputs being like how many people are using the medicine, and outcomes being how many people are alive as a result. There was also a sense, though, that even where those things were working, there were other areas that weren't being discussed. And there were other issues that, even if you wanted to take on extreme poverty, you had to think about more clearly too. And there were issues like, how strong are the institutions? Or is there, and it depends on your interpretation, is there rule of law? Is there a fight against corruption? Is there human rights? Different people had different views on how to define a public institution. But on the heels of things like the 2008 financial crisis and food crisis and even fuel price crisis, people started to wake up to this sense of volatility and things not working was much broader than just the issues of poorest of the poor. And there were a lot of middle income countries that were saying, well, we're getting hammered too, but we're not included in the extreme poverty discussion. By the way, but we have other big problems. We have poverty, we have inequality, we have massive urbanization that needs to be supported in a different way. And we need goals to work for us. And then in that context, there was a big conversation, especially after the Rio 2012 UN summit, that agreed to set something called Sustainable Development Goals that said, well, We also have this massive set of issues around climate change. We have a massive set of issues around how we manage the global commons, the environment, biodiversity. Those are major conversations happening that interact with and intersect with everything we're talking about here. And we can't say it's, climate change versus poverty or inequality. It has to be all of them together. And then as one went down that path as well, another thread came in, which is, well, all the so-called advanced economies have their own problems too. How do you draw a boundary between a country that's quote unquote figured it out versus a country that's still figuring it out? And that led to, I think, what my colleague Homi Karas has described from switching thinking and mindsets from the developing world to a developing world. Because what became clear was if sustainable development is distilled as the economic, social, and environmental challenges that the world faces, every country is facing their own version of those problems. And so through a long couple of years of intergovernmental negotiations and a lot of different sources of input, including a public survey that 8 million people around the world fed into, which is, to my knowledge, the largest and most inclusive public consultation ever on a global agenda setting process. 17 goals were set in 2015. And as one of the lead negotiators said to me, because the initial response was 17, how can you have so many goals? And one of the lead negotiators said, they're amazed to this day that it wasn't more, because there's so many other issues that people were saying you can't forget in the global agenda. This division, this binary division of poor versus rich countries doesn't match the complexity of the world today. And so these goals were set with the end of extreme poverty as the first among equals, the so-called second half agenda of the Millennium Development Goals. But then all these other issues around social inclusion, successful cities, jobs and prosperity, innovation, environmental management, institutions, and so forth were added, and that gave us the Sustainable Development Goals.
You have to, obviously there was a great deal of political salience that backed the Millennium Development Goals, perhaps because they were so limited in number and so simple and straightforward. That's one argument. I know that the amount of ODA increased over the decade, or between 2001 and 2015, by 50%, for a lot of other reasons, but clearly the Millennium Development Goals inspired that. There is the argument that the 17 are so complex that they've lost some political salience. But you're trying, it seems to me, through this 17 Rooms project, to make them more salient and individually by creating action plans. Tell us a little bit about how you're doing that, because you're engaging a lot of people in this process. You're engaging the people that are watching here today, as well as universities around the world and individuals that care about them. Some of them care more about some of the 17 goals than others because they're affected by them. So tell us a little bit about how your 17 Rooms project works.
Well, maybe I can address the complexity issue and then use that to help explain some of the motivation for 17 Rooms first, if that's okay, Brian.
Because, sure. Yeah.
And I'll do so by way of a story, if that's okay. So on the day these goals were finalized at the diplomatic level, it was Sunday, August the 2nd, 2015. And this conversation had been going on for years about how to set these goals and what they should be. And I was sitting in my apartment in Washington watching the online UN TV, and the diplomats had been up for nights, I know, in this overtime, extra innings, pick your metaphor, sleepless nights to get all the T's crossed and I's dotted on words and an agenda that everyone could agree on. And I called my mother that day back in Vancouver, where I grew up, And my mother retired, very supportive, like many of our parents, probably doesn't know exactly how I spend my days. But, I said, Mom, those goals I've been talking about, and the end of extreme poverty was the first one, as I mentioned. I said, the world agreed to do that today. It's pretty exciting. She said, well, that sounds exciting. I said, yeah, it is. Actually, it was actually emotional, I think, for many of us who have been involved. And words are just words, but they matter in terms of setting a new standard. I said, then I had in the back of my mind to give a few speeches the next week or in the following couple of weeks. And I knew I was going to have to talk about these goals. I said, there's only one problem. She said, what's that? I said, there's 17 of them, these goals. I don't know how to explain them.
Right.
And she said, I think I might have told you this before, Brian, but she said, 17, that's a great number. And I said, you're the first person to say that. And there'd been this huge global debate over how many goals should there be. There were 8 before, should be expanded to 10 to round it out. Is 12 the right number? And really no one loved the 17. And my mom said, well, 17 sounds like they didn't fake it. The world's complicated. I said, and she said, later came back to me and said, if they'd given me some Letterman style top 10, I probably wouldn't have believed them. It's like, it's interesting. And for those who don't know, David Letterman was the famous talk show host in past generations who had these nightly top 10s every night. And that actually was an interesting thought to me. And the next week I was in Geneva at the World Economic Forum talking with 500 people who are out in the audience who are from around the world, business, government, science, nonprofits, people who had not been involved in these negotiations. And I really just gave the simplest version of the presentation in this opening session. I said, extreme poverty is going down like this and greenhouse gas emissions are going up like that. And I just ad-libbed this line of my mother's. And what does everyone come up to me for the next few days saying? They say, I love these goals. It's like your mom says, the world's complicated. And crucially, I can see my issue in there. The thing I care about is in those goals.
Right.
And over time, I realized there's a different way to think about what these goals are. The way they're often described, including by my friends at the UN, is, well, the UN agreed on these, therefore the world needs to care about them, pay attention. But what they actually are is the opposite. These are the 17 issues that the world told the UN not to forget about. And each of these goals and each of the underlying targets has some critical mass constituency that said, this matters, you can't forget about this, and we're not going anywhere, to an extent that the intergovernmental process couldn't argue back. Yeah, you're right, it's not going anywhere. I like to ask, and I didn't do it here as we were all joining online, but I very often ask, what's the single biggest issue in the world, in any room? What's the single biggest problem the world needs to solve? Doesn't take a very big room to get all 17 of those issues, because every person has their own perspective on what's the single biggest issue.
Right.
That led me to realize I'd spent all these years, and I'd worked on this in different venues academically and otherwise, in creating new degree programs that helped people learn about natural science, social science, management, and health science, and the need for more connective tissue in our problem solving. And what I realized, having had the privileged experience of working with these Millennium Development Goal focused constituencies, which was often the world's leading hunger experts, or the world's leading education experts, and experts in all senses of the term, the grassroots, the grass tops, the institutional, the scientific, the nonprofit. But, the health people, you realize the maternal health conversation is very different than the tuberculosis conversation, is very different from the child survival conversation, because each of these communities self-organizes, and each of them has their own institutions.
Right.
And crucially, they all have their own languages, and they all go to their own meetings.
And, you know, if you run a development agency, you also find that they don't like to understand the relationship among these things. I mean, providing opportunities for women entrepreneurs is related to education, it's related to environment, it's related to all these other things. Anyway.
No, and we are in a university environment here today. I increasingly liken it to a university. And that's actually quite intentional, because much of this comes out of how people are trained in universities and different academic environments.
Discipline.
So the tribes, the professional epistemic tribalism starts in school, where people in the School of Public Health have different outlooks than the people in the School of Engineering, have different outlooks than the people in the School of Food Science, have different outlooks in the economics department, have different outlooks in the anthropology department and the literature department, and on and on.
That's why we like public policy schools.
Well, when they're done right.
That's right.
Because when they bring together the different disciplines in a translation mechanism for tapping the insights, and also tapping into, and it's very important, I think, the different objective functions that different disciplines have. You know, as I crudely summarize it, in health science, first principle is to save the person's life and do no harm, Hippocratic oath. Right. In economics, the first principle, historically, although I would argue it's evolving, is marginal utility and what's the best value of an incremental dollar. And often in social science, there's a training around, ultimately anchored in skepticism around disproving nostrums. And if anyone ever goes to an economics seminar, you know, the battleground as it is, it's known as, you know, everyone's trying to test the robustness by kicking the tires, as a polite term, on what's being presented. In natural sciences, it's a more positivist, a crude mindset around putting forward the positive result often. And that is each of these is a different mindset, and each has different units of analysis, different terms they use. And because they all go to different conferences and different meetings and read different journals, there's no place that they all get together under the same roof. Certainly not in policy terms. Maybe they do at a university convocation. But in that sense, the original vision of 17 rooms, which I developed with someone, I don't know if you ever crossed paths with, there was Margaret Biggs, who was president of CEDA at one point, the final president of the Canadian International Development Agency, but it also run policy and planning for the domestic Canadian Privy Council office. So it was very, very deeply versed in how governments think about things. And she was, post-public service career, and we'd been working on some things, and we started talking about what if there was a meeting that got all these different 17 communities together in plenary, sent them into their own breakout groups to focus on their actions and what they would do next year, and then brought them back in plenary to report out, and had a lot of coffee breaks in between to really foster the connectivity that comes through informal connections. Wouldn't that be an interesting way to think about organizing for the SDGs? And a variety of things happened where some people were interested, others said, oh, well, if that happens, I'll join in, things like that. But long story short, it was only a conversation with a friend and colleague who was at the time at the Rockefeller Foundation. And we were talking about this, and it was 2018. And I said, well, I explained this basic idea of, plenary breakout rooms, get back together. He said, 17, we could do that, couldn't we? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, 17 rooms, why don't we call it that? And I said, great idea. That's exactly what it is. And so he and I pulled together on very short notice in the fall of 2018 on the eve of the General Assembly in New York, the UN General Assembly, which convenes every September at high level. People come to town. There's a kind of a policy jamboree around Manhattan. And we said, why don't we get people together just informally around this question of what would you do next year? What would be a decisive step forward? And then report out in plenary. And we found in doing this and emphasizing, if you will, a bit of the human side of like, let's make everyone's got such serious subject matter, how do you make this creative and even fun? As a participant, we found that people were very positively inclined to have this type of conversation because it was novel. It was novel to be thinking about what next. It was novel to be thinking about my problem alongside your problem. And we found that people were very interested to have the chance to report out and have those coffee break type mindsets. And that was a very rapidly pulled together undertaking. So then, since then, and I'm happy to get into it, it's led to a whole set of experimentations. There's now an annual process at the flagship level, but then in that very first meeting, I said, just like this is 17 rooms, you know, and just like there's a TED Global and a TEDx, maybe we could have a 17 rooms and a 17 rooms X, and this could be a global meeting, but you could think of any community doing it. It's not a perfect analogy for all sorts of reasons, but it's, you know, the notion of how could people do this themselves in their own community. And that idea, I think, took hold over time. And it's led to a whole set of insights around the ways in which 17 rooms can be a helpful approach for conversations around the complexity of sustainable development that might be feeling a bit stuck, to help them get unstuck. And we've really started to work in the past couple of years around, you know, codifying that, making it into a set of more foundational principles. And that's led to the 17 rooms as it is today.
That's interesting. And looking at some of your literature, you've managed to engage people from a lot of different parts of the world, and a lot of different people with different statures in society as well. Now, how do you get people, for example, the working class, involved in something like this?
Well, I think there's a first principle, which is we're working at, in our, you know, we're a small team, just to be very clear. So we have a few people at Brookings and a few people at the Rockefeller Foundation. We're very privileged institutions. We're very aware of that, and always trying to create public goods on everything we're doing. But we're trying to think through, and as my colleague Zia Khan at the foundation and I describe, our life would be a lot easier if there were only 3 rooms, because you know, it's a lot to organize,
right?
How to think through what the different types of people are that might match the different types of topics within each room. And very importantly, we're not intending to replace any existing processes. We're aiming to complement them. And maybe just to take a big step back, if it's okay, Brian, you know, I think we've realized there are 2 big types of buckets of problems that we're navigating or confronting. The first is what I would call the international scale bucket, where institutions are feeling a bit stuck. You know, the formal methods of what one might call the legacy institutions in the world that people when I was growing up, people might have deferred to. A lot of them are, you know, less deferred to in many ways, but also they're less feeling equipped to the task. And then a second issue, and that's for many deep reasons, not only their own fault. Often, you know, the public institutions are owned by their members and member states and all this, and the member states aren't getting along, the institutions will suffer as a result. But the other issue is this notion of the siloed undertakings, and that, you know, these problems are interconnected. So a woman who doesn't have access to healthcare because they're poor, because their farm isn't growing enough, because there's no energy in the community, because the institutions are failing, you know, on and on and on. One can't take too narrow a view. One has to be understanding all the intersecting issues that lead to individual problems and individual constraints, and of course, community constraints. And so how does one break the silos in a way that's practical? a lot of universities can write and a lot of eminent technical people, if one looks at Nature family of journals, you see a lot of important science on the interconnections between issues, but that's often harder at a practical level for people to take a next step on. So those international issues are this sense of stuckness among the institutions and also siloed between the different constituencies. At the local level, which I think is part of where your question was going, these goals, if someone's heard of them, and very often they haven't even heard of them, of course, right. They're typically perceived as too big. It's a massive issue, bigger than anything I can take on personally. They're often felt as too far off. 2030 is not really a helpful reference point, when I'm dealing with a pandemic and a crisis, or even just getting through the year. Right. Even when there's not a pandemic, 15 years or 10 years is a long time to do anything practical. And then a third crucial constraint I find, or bottleneck, is people say, well, that's a UN thing. I don't go to the UN. I'm not one of those people. I live here in my community. And that localized bucket of, I would say, constraints is something that we realize is also part of what 17 Rooms is trying to take on. And in that spirit, we said, we've realized both through this flagship, which has been the thing, that we directly coordinate, but also through a growing community of practice of kind of opening up the shop to people who want to do it themselves through the 17 Rooms community of practice. We've identified 3 basic design principles. And this is highly experimental. It's very possible that if we have this conversation a year from now, they'll be evolved or different or slightly added. But the first is all goals get a seat at the table. So it's not my goal versus your goal, but it's all of our goals together. That is very, very different from, especially how political figures often talk, or even institutional leaders, which is we need to set priorities. And what that ultimately means is my issue versus your issue. And that's a false choice very often if people are already working on those issues. The question isn't to tell someone they're more or less important. The question is how to get the most support to each person who's already working on something important. The second design principle is take a next step, not a perfect step. And so this is, again, a complement to the deeper dives that might happen in some institutions or sometimes don't. But the driving question is, what can be done over the next 12 to 18 months to make a difference? And the phrase we use is something big enough to make a difference, but small enough to get done. So that degree of practicality is aiming to prompt, next steps that matter, as opposed to arguments over what would perfect look like. And often, if you get a diverse group of people together, they might have different views on perfect, but they might be able to find common ground sooner on a great next step. Right. And that spirit is important because also 17 Rooms is not about what they need to do out there in the world, but about what we can do as people getting together in a room. And then the third key design principle that really makes it possible is the notion of conversation, not presentation. So this is not someone getting in front of a theater or an auditorium and just talking at people, quite the opposite. It's people getting together in rooms to talk about, what they could do together. Those 3 design principles seem to be quite powerful for any type of community. Because we've now seen, and some universities have actually been the first movers, somewhat to my surprise, to start using these techniques, from universities in Spain to Mexico to the US to Canada so far, to say everything from how do we align our research agendas with each other, to how do we align our strategic plan with these sustainable development goals, to how do we align what we're talking about as our stated ambitions with our partners in the community and other stakeholders that we're meant to be working with outside the walls of the university. We've also seen a growing number of cities and localities starting to take this on, and even in some instances, countries starting to look at this to say, how can we have a national conversation on these, using these basic techniques? So there are lots of layers underneath that we've started to discover in terms of different types of problems for which people might get together in a room, whether it's like something's stuck and needs a new consensus, or something has some ideas floating that people need to kick the tires on, trial balloons we call it, or something that needs just get stuff done, but needs some coordination for people to get stuff done that everyone actually agrees need to get done. So those are different types of processes that we're seeing the merits of. But we're also seeing this notion, it's a bit of a paradox built in, of what we call each room picking a swim lane within the swim lane. So we have all these little tagline metaphors we use, but so often these goals are described as the massive, massive issues, and it leads to a conversation about what's perfect across everything, which is very hard to get anything done in a short amount of time. And so we say, don't boil the ocean in your room. Don't talk about everything under the sun of goal 3 for health and well-being. That's just massive, massive, massive set of topics. Pick what we call a swim lane within a swim lane. It's okay to pick a sliver of the goal that you think is pertinent to the people in this room, and think about how you could together take action amongst yourselves. And again, that basic set of ingredients could happen in a community center in any community in the world, or in a global convention center in any capital in the world. It could be anywhere that those basic premises can be applied. And so we're now very actively thinking about how we might be able to open this up to broader constituencies, so that they have what I would call a drop-down menu for their own 17 rooms conversation, that they could do this to make the goals approachable and actionable,
right,
based on the things that people care about in their local community, as opposed to, too far off, too big picture, too long-term, and I don't go to the UN. Make it about, oh, here's what's proximate to us, here's what we care about, but here's something that crucially needs us to cooperate to make a dent on our local issues. And that, just final point on this thread, is that is ultimately the aha that I had, another aha I had, but on even thinking about what these goals are about. These goals aren't just about getting all these people together around the things they already care about. Changing the wording from 17 goals to 17 rooms switches people's mindsets from goals are out there issues that we're all going to look towards, to rooms are right here issues that people get together in rooms every day, or in villages, or in different, whatever the right hut or structure is for a different community. But it focuses on the people getting together to cooperate. And ultimately that matters, because goals are only achieved when people get together in rooms to think about what they can do together to cooperate to make a difference. So the flipping of the wording makes a difference to how people feel that they themselves have a role to contribute. And that, in my view, is important for how we think about the future of international cooperation. Because in a world of TikTok and Facebook and LinkedIn and Weibo and whatever your favorite social network technology is, there are some issues that need global coordination for sure. Vaccines, high on the list. But there are many issues that need bottom-up input and design and innovation on how they're going to approach it. Even vaccines, by the way, on the list.
Right.
And so that notion of how people cooperate on a common set of reference points and a common language around common objectives, but on their own terms, in their own space, I think is actually a much deeper point for how we think about the future of international institutions.
Yeah, and I know we've got one person who wants to put their hand up. Please use the hand raise function under reactions there if you want to ask a question. This obviously relates to another aspect of where donors and partners are going as well with respect to local ownership. And so, I mean, local ownership can be as local as a neighborhood, I mean, or whatever. I mean, it just seems to me that is very consistent with that kind of thinking about what some people call the decolonization of aid or whatever. Evan, you have had your hand up. Ask a question, if you will. If you go off of mute and ask us. Evan, you're on mute. Okay. Oh, well, your hand looks like it's up, but you know how to put your hand up if you want a question. Please, let's have some questions.
I actually had a question, if you don't
Good.
mind.
Go ahead, Tanya.
First of all, thank you for being here. This is great. I had a question specifically about human security. Do you think that the difference between human security and sustainable development, like generally, is significant enough? It feels like human security tries to tackle a lot of the things that sustainable development does, but for some reason, it's a goal within sustainable development. So I was wondering if you, I don't know, had any thoughts on that. Do you think they overlap a lot or not?
You're on mute, I think, John.
What an interesting question. I'm guessing Brian might have lived through some of the evolution of those debates too. I mean, the human security concept has a very, very important heritage in elevating, I would say, key dimensions of sustainable development. And there's a lot of someone named Sadako Ogata who was very important in elevating that, very prominent Japanese policy leader and thought leader globally. And there's a huge effort to think through, how to frame the issues to trigger different types of responses. My simple answer is I think, yes, very much human security is very consistent with sustainable development as a set of concepts. I think sustainable development is ultimately a broader set of concepts. And these 17 goals I boil down as 3 types of problems. And this is just a distillation I've iterated on and with a colleague, Homi Karas, over the years. But the first is what we call recoupling economic progress with assessments of well-being. So getting out of poverty is important, crucial for anyone, and that is a brass tacks income prosperity issue for individuals and households. But getting out of poverty in a way that people feel their life is getting better is even more important. And the notion of economies doing better, but people not feeling that they're doing better is a much more widespread concern than it was a generation ago. And there's a whole so-called happiness literature, but also more technical terms, subjective well-being. There are very basic measures of this, like life expectancy. So in recent years, the US has seen dips in life expectancy even prior to COVID. Other parts of the industrialized world have as well. My home province of British Columbia has seen a dip in life expectancy. Parts of the UK, a dip in life expectancy, even while the economy was growing. But we also see in so-called subjective well-being studies that even when economies are growing, people often feel like their life isn't getting better. And that's a deep issue where when I was in graduate school, it was something of an article of faith that as long as the economy was doing better, all these other indicators would be doing better. And now I think the bottom line is someone sees a headline, economy is doing better, oh, so what? What does that mean for my family? Would be a basic question. And that's a pretty broadly held question in countries around the world. But there's a second problem, which we call the decoupling. And this is something of a term of art in the environmental world. And there the problem is that every new unit of economic progress, which we need for people to share in prosperity, is cranking out a corresponding unit of environmental problem. And climate change is in many ways the most high profile of that form of problem. In many ways, climate change is paradoxically a problem of economic success. But that is exactly why the decarbonization agenda is so important, because we need to reduce the amount of emissions per unit of GDP to such an extent in order to maintain the warming of the planet to a manageable limit, that we really have to be thinking about entirely eliminating units of greenhouse gas emissions per unit of GDP. That's a simpler framing of the problem in my view. Rather than worry about, is it 93%, 95%, 96%, just think about it as 100%, because then you have to do it everywhere. But it's not only climate change, it's also fisheries. It's also our food systems. It's also air pollution, which kills millions of people every year, particulate emissions. These are PM 2.5 so-called. It's a massive, massive issue in many parts of the world, including in, from California to, India most recently again has had, this massive increase, but this is a major issue, particulate emissions. Then the third issue is what I call the we coupling. And that's that we're all in it together. And in the SDG jargon, it's leave no one behind. And the upshot is that in every part of the world, people are tired of getting left behind due to some aspect of their self or their identity, whether that's gender, whether that's race, whether that's indigenous status, class, geography, sexual orientation. The bottom line is it's no longer good enough for societies to succeed on average. They have to succeed for everyone, and everyone has to have equal access to the opportunities of their society. That thread is, in my view, a through line of why even we have to be thinking about in human terms, the SDGs as specific development goals. Because ultimately, we're a bounded universe. There might be nearly 8 billion people on the planet, but that's actually a very specific number of people. And every issue has a specific person being left behind on a specific problem in a specific place. And often a specific person being left behind for multiple specific reasons in a specific place. So that need to get specific, which we've also spent some time thinking through, like how many people on each issue in each place? How can we so-called hyper-target our efforts? How is technology helping us with that? And we've seen even some of the poorest places in the world are providing some of the most exciting breakthroughs and using technology, digital technology, to hyper-target with the newest methods and algorithms, the poorest people, places like Togo during the pandemic, extraordinary breakthrough. Many partners came together in the crisis. But all of this is, I think, a broader, it's all consistent with human security, but it's a broader concept of how the pieces need to fit together. But then crucially, going back to how we're talking about the SDGs, this challenge of sustainable development, of recoupling, decoupling, and we coupling, that's a challenge that no country has yet solved. There's no society that has successfully figured out how to do all three at once, including my home country of Canada. And those questions, including in Canada, which I've thought a bunch about, are independent of the international aid conversations. They're not about how much help Canada gets from the outside. They're about how Canada and the actors within Canada very often take on and define their own problem-solving processes and measure accordingly towards results. That is a very different way to think about policy goals than the Millennium Development Goals, which are about how do we, of the most privileged parts of the world, provide help to the least privileged parts of the world on a kind of a neutral, peer reviewable basis. This is about how do we each take on our own pieces of the puzzle, which, yes, in some cases does include the most privileged people in the world financially giving support to the least. But it also means we have to think about our own domestic challenges in a new way, who's getting left behind for which reasons, where we need to decouple our prosperity strategy from our environmental pain. And we need to think very differently about our accountability mechanisms on problems that often don't yet have solutions. So many of the hardest problems, I'll just raise child obesity as an example, is getting worse in pretty much every country in the world. There is no person I know in the food policy space who will say, oh, here's the 1, 2, 3, silver bullets for that. Roughly speaking, this is an unsolved problem, which is really hard. It needs everything from better approaches to food systems, to nutrition, to urban planning, to education systems, to, where people live, how they get to work, all these things. That is the type of unsolved problem that needs a common goal to get everyone on the same page, literally and figuratively, so that different communities can come up with their own approaches and test them and innovate, and then they can learn from each other in a way that is about peer learning. And so that is a much higher degree of complexity, going back to your earlier question, than what's the best way to transfer resources. It's much more about how do we measure progress of our society on some issues which require very different stakeholders to come together. So that's far more than I'm sure you were hoping for in an answer on human security, but it gives a kind of a broader tour on how I think some of these issues fit together.
You see me smiling a bit. I'm remembering Mrs. Ogata. You mentioned her at the beginning, and she, of course, I think raised this. She would be very pleased to see the extent to which her concept has been elaborated on by you, John, and in a very positive way, I might add. But if she, of course, was the head of the United Nations, she was the High Commissioner for Refugees. So her concept was, I think, thinking in the context of fragile states and what makes people feel threatened, and in transitions from violent conflict, obviously establishing a rule of law and people you could trust that would actually run a government that would have your own welfare in mind was obviously what was on her mind as well. But we now know that obviously people feel insecure and they act out on that basis. If they feel insecure about any aspect of their life, they will act out on it. And I think that's one of the sources of populism in the Western countries in particular. I see that Felix, you have a question.
Yes, hi, Professor Atwood and Dr. McArthur. Thank you so much for this very interesting event. My name is Felipe Felix Mendez, and I am a senior here at Brown from Panama, studying international and public affairs. And my question is, how did you and your team at the Center for Sustainable Development at Brookings go about choosing the members and moderators for each working group? And 1 year in, with the benefit of hindsight, what takeaways do you think you have? What improvements? What would you have done differently as it pertains to other people trying to do similar things and building working groups that will lead to such results?
Oh, great question. I think the simplest answer, so we have these two parallel tracks that we're aiming to increasingly feed into each other. We have this flagship process that, well, as we call it now, which is the international scale problem solving, roughly speaking, and then this community of practice, which is the localized efforts. And some people are involved in both, but really it's the flagship is, again, we're a very small team. What can we coordinate? And then, how do we help others coordinate through the community of practice and learn from each other? In the flagship, I think we've had a gradually expanding set of networks where it started with, in the simple sense, like people we knew, both in the Brookings and my network, my colleagues' networks at the Rockefeller Foundation. We kind of just like, having worked on a lot of these issues over the years, we happen to know a bunch of people who are working on all sorts of different issues, and who's going to be in New York and, come together. Over time, we've said, well, let's start to be more thoughtful about how we can grow the participatory process to go beyond certainly our existing networks, but also to tie into different streams of activity and different types of problems that might be ripe for action. And so we had, for example, in room 14 this year on oceans in the flagship, we were colleagues who had previously co-chaired that said, oh, there's this really amazing person in Kenya who's doing amazing work on reef management, and you should talk to him. And so we talked to him, and then he brought in a whole different dimension of oceans management. So that kind of a classic, if you will, directed search across networks. One of the other things that's been really interesting, though, is that because we were forced to go virtual last year amidst the pandemic, it really went from 17 rooms to 17 Zooms. And we've done entirely virtual processes. And that has been, in a wonderful way, much more inclusive, that people can join from any part of the world. And we're not pretending to be the global convener on any of this. We're always aspiring to be a helpful undertaking that's contributing. Big difference between those two. And so we are now thinking about, how do we, and there's only a couple hundred people per year that can be involved, just given the nature of the undertaking in this global flagship. How do we make that more and more inclusive? How do we have concentric circles of consultation where it makes sense? But again, very tight time budgets among people who are really volunteering their time. That's one of the things we're always trying to figure out: what's the most efficient way to accelerate these forms of cooperation, not boil the ocean of cooperation. But then in parallel, this notion of developing methods of learning, we even have on our team an amazing person, Jacob Taylor, who's coordinating this community of practice, who's been, he's an anthropologist by training, focused on collective intelligence, and his whole research agenda is on how do you get people to collaborate at different scales of cooperation, and how do you understand the motivations and methods through which they cooperate. I'm sure I just totally garbled his expertise, but that's how I think of it. And so, this is part of what we're trying to work on, is as different use cases have evolved, what's the core version of what's relevant to different communities? And then what's the bit that communities need flexibility on? And that is a non-trivial undertaking, because we want 17 rooms to mean something, but we also want it to be helpful. And so you have to make sure it means something, at least at a minimum, that's consistent across different constituencies, but also can be tailored and adjusted and also innovated through all the experimentation that clever people will come up with that I could never think of sitting in my office in Washington, DC. So that's part of the yin and yang of the undertaking, is having a flagship where we put in place really, I would say, directed experimentation, but also opening it up so others can come up with their insights that help us learn.
John, you have the Rockefeller Foundation supporting you. I would imagine,
partners, full partners, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. How do you, what are they asking of you? I mean, how do you measure success in what you're doing? In other words, what can you point to when it comes time, to renew that relationship with the Rockefeller Foundation? How do you measure success?
Well, I won't speak on their behalf ever, but I would say it's not a
linear.
It's not a grant. They provide resources, absolutely, and that's they're an institutional philanthropy, and we're a nonprofit, and that they do certainly provide us core support, but it really is a partnership undertaking based on, I think, complementary expertise. So my co-chair, I'm the co-chair with Zia Khan, who's an amazing colleague, collaborator, friend at this stage. And, our teams are in day-to-day collaboration on all sorts of things, but it's about the comparative advantage. We have kind of a division of labor on
Mhm.
We work on these pieces, they work on those pieces. They have some institutional priorities where they have deep expertise. We have expertise on certain issues, so we really try to bring it together to make the sum, the whole greater than the sum of the parts. I think we often ask ourselves jointly, how do we think about success, and how do we think about both bottling the process innovations we're coming up with, and how do we measure different forms of contribution. So we've really identified 3 basic value propositions together, and our reports, our public reports on the undertaking are joint, and we really do think about it together. We have action. So what are the actions that come out of this? The flagship, what does each room come up with, and what does it lead to?
Right.
So this year in room 17, and we even have a podcast on this year where we're talking with each of the room moderators on what they came up with, how does it fit in? And room 17 this year has it was co-moderated by the leader of the anti-human trafficking program at the McCain Institute and the co-CIA of sustainability at Bridgewater, the hedge fund. And they are working on, with their group, which is a mix of institutional investors and anti-human trafficking experts. And full disclosure, Bridgewater does give support to Brookings as well, but that was independent of this. Mm-hmm. They came up with the need for a new form of data tool or mechanism that could help investors report on where there was risk of forced labor in company level supply chains. Mm-hmm. This is a major movement at the legislative level in multiple countries. Australia has recently passed legislation that all investors need to report on this. It's a big deal in the natural resource and extractive industries. But the investors feel like they don't have adequate information to report well enough. And the activists are saying, who have spent years as experts on this are saying, look over here, and right. Here's a problem. We can tell you about this company in this place. And so how do you fuse those perspectives of like the availability of the data and the reporting mechanism, the efficiency that's required? And that's what they're working on. So they've committed to work on something in that regard next year. We'll see what it comes to. It would be a public good. And so our measure of success would be what comes of that. And we never predicted this would come up, but we kind of had a sense that there was a there if we put these forces together, that they could come up with something good. Mm-hmm. So that's an example at the overarching level. But the second is, it's not just the actions, it's the insights. And this is a really important piece where the action orientation of these processes seems to give a lot of ahas in terms of what people learn, both within their rooms and across rooms. That is an interesting piece because we've even seen the two come together across 3 of the rooms this year, 13, 14, 15, for those who don't know all the goals. That's climate, oceans, and life on land, biodiversity. They came up with an idea, started in room 15, but it was a more broadly appreciated to nature-based solutions as a whole logic for investing in policy. And they came up with, interestingly, a natural security initiative and strategies and even a mindset around investing in nature to protect people, and how that could motivate a whole different frame, everything from climate negotiations into the COP to, the ecosystem. There's a whole parallel biodiversity convention, COP underway, lead up. And so they're thinking about these joint insights, how that could be tapped and become kind of an ongoing effort to really crystallize an additional and complementary wave of investments that are in nature, but also for people. Yeah. The third then real value proposition is around community and bringing all these people together with the spirit of conversations, not presentations, and ideally check your institutional agendas at the door, because this isn't about what's best for your organization, it's about what's best for an issue. This neutral platform seems to create a different type of space for people to connect. And we spent a lot of time thinking about how to even curate connections between rooms in ways that are productive. I'm sure you can imagine all the ways that it can be unproductive, Brian. I think we've all learned and lived through the nightmares. Like, we wasted so much time. If only this had happened, it would have been a useful conversation. So we only have a handful of hours, but with all these amazing people, we're trying to think about what are the codified ways that you can build that insight and community between people that might not otherwise get to have that conversation. That creates a shared sense of, oh, we are in this together, and that was really helpful. Mm-hmm. And so we are in the process of really thinking through how to codify and measure that. There's a design and even research component around that. So I'd say watch this space. Don't know what the answers are going to be, but we're thinking of multiple dimensions of what success would look like. And I've even, recently publicly proposed, I used to whisper it, but now I say it a little more loudly. What would a global 17 rooms day look like? What we have the General Assembly every year, late September. What if every September 17th or something, communities around the world got together to think through their next steps for the SDGs in a way that was them writing their own story. No one should have to wait on world presidents and prime ministers to get together at the UN. They should be thinking about, well, our community is going to do this. And if anything, people wonder what the heck those presidents and prime ministers do when they go to the UN anyways. So it wouldn't be good to have a constructive pressure that communities say, here's what we're doing. Now, how about you for these goals that you guys committed to, but we're the ones who are leading on. So we're in the middle of thinking that through. What would that maybe look like to make this more of a broad-based undertaking where there's interest for people to organize themselves, but again, problem solve in parallel and in concert around these issues that people care about.
It seems that a logical home for some of this work would be public policy schools like the Watson Institute or the Humphrey School, where I was the dean, and at the Kennedy School where you attended, and because it requires a lot of interdisciplinary thinking. But I'm going to ask the burning question that I think the students would want to ask, but probably don't feel they should. And that is, do you have internships down there for some of the students that are interested in these things?
We do. I just got a note. We just recruited our next one for the new semester in the new year. We do have internships. They are competitive. I'm always shocked by the number of amazing people who apply, but they're around Brookings, I should say, not just in our center. And we have multiple streams of internship in our center itself. Different, I say, as we use the jargon that they're scholars, but different scholar teams are working on different issues. And many of the scholars are much more practitioner focused in their work. Some are more academic, some are more, practical, and some are a hybrid of the two. So we have lots of people working on lots of things in our center and also around Brookings. So by all means, any amazing students at Brown, I'm sure would only be warmly welcome and encouraged to apply.
We only have amazing students at Brown, by the way, but yes.
Well, that's a given. That's a given.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, I really want to thank you for doing this for us. I know you had to adjust your schedule so that you could do it. I think you say schedule in Canada, but I'm not sure.
I'm sure there's a hybrid on the 49 barrel. Yeah.
It's been really helpful. And if any of the students that have watched this or are watching on the recording want to get in touch with you, is that all right? I mean, do you have,
by all means,
do you want to, do you have an email or something that you want to put out there?
They can go to the website and just send me a note, or if you want to introduce them to me afterwards. Yeah, there's a button on the website if you want to get in touch.
The Brookings Institution website, right?
Yeah.
Well, this has been really great. I mean, I think the bottom line for the long run for this kind of an exercise is creating a political will to get some of these action plans actually moving. And to the extent that you can have the broadest possible consensus on an action plan, any one of the 17, it seems to me a really, really useful exercise. And I really commend you for the passion that you show in describing this, but for all of the follow-up that you do, because it's really badly needed. And I wish there were many, many more John McArthurs in this world to do this kind of work.
Well, I'm sure there are many who think one is more than enough. So thank you, Brian. But as I said, you know, maybe just a final, I do think that, and I'm such an admirer of all you've done, if you'll permit me a slight disagreement at the conclusion here.
Okay.
I actually have a mild allergy, full disclosure, to the term political will.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Because having lived through so many debates over the years, I find that what it often comes down to is the need for a sharpened strategy on how to convince someone to do something next.
Yeah.
And so the notion of translating the need for change into practical next steps is ultimately the same motivating spirit as 17 rooms. Okay, so you got this big issue, it needs a long term. Something has to be done next, you know. So what's that thing? What could make a difference?
Right.
And so I do want to conclude very sincerely by saying, you know, one of the things I am profoundly convinced of is that these issues, especially the really big ones and long-term ones, but even others, really benefit from intergenerational collaboration.
Right.
Because it's the fresh perspective and the often moral clarity of a young generation, but also the technological ingenuity and the fresh take on a new approach, mixed with the experience, the wisdom, the resources, the battle scars of the previous generations that, you know, allows great things to happen. And so mixing, the energy, insight, clarity of a young generation with the savvy, hopefully, but also the guardrails, or even the encouragement of previous generation, I think is a central through line in so many big breakthroughs. And so it's part of why I really, salute what you're doing, Brian, and with the students. But I also want to salute the students for showing up in the middle of exams, because I know this is probably the worst time of year to do anything. And, anyone who is listening today, I just want, it's so important, I think, that you feel that this is your story that you're going to be writing. And if people like me and wherever I sit in the world can be supportive, please know that that's my absolute priority to do so. So thank you so much.
Well, I have plenty of scar tissue to share, which is why I'm trying to encourage young people to get into these issues. But thank you. And thanks all of you who've taken time out of your studies to hear this, and hope you're inspired by it, because I am. So thank you, John, very much. Appreciate
Wonderful.
it. And,
thank you so much. All right. Take care. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Nice to see you all.
Okay.
Thank you.